So you seem to think this is a logical contradiction. That somehow, if somebody doubts the official story about the Holocaust and is interested in revisionist takes on the question, well, somehow that person must see it as super important. It can't possibly be a person who is interested in it and yet also says, it doesn't really matter that much. It's not central to the goal of preserving our people, of making a better tomorrow for our children. Somehow that doesn't make sense. So I guess I have to assume then, Kraut, that anything you have any interest in is of vital importance to you, huh? So, your video games or whatever the hell you get up to, man, it's like super politically charged, right? It's all very important. The future depends upon getting feminists out of video games. Is that right? Should I assume that? Come on, man. You're grasping at straws here, and I think you know it.
That's hilarious. Oh, no, you're getting us wrong. Holocaust denial is not essential to us. When we post our memes about the 6 million, that is just a meme. It isn't essential to our peaceful means of achieving our peaceful goals. Wrong, it is essential to your beliefs and ideology as a fascist and a white nationalist. Ideologies, in my humble opinion, cannot be killed by outside forces, but die through their own failures. Socialism died because of its inability to build and preserve a society that can sustain itself, and its failures manifested themselves through the lack of freedom, famines, and misery. Your ideology died for its inability to sustain a society as well, for its lack of freedoms, and for its cruel barbarity. The barbarism inflicted upon the world in the name of fascism, from the torture cellars of the Gestapo to the concentration camps to the millions butchered in Slavic lands, is why your ideology has ultimately been defeated. It's why a war was fought to have it defeated, a war to save that very civilization that you proclaim to want to save. As such, it is relevant to you people. It is why you keep trying your best to deny it, because the defining aspect, the defining image of your ideology is not smiling white children as you would wish to portray it. It's mangled corpses and burning villages. It is somewhat ironic that it is the ideology that proclaims to be the savior of the white race that has, in its history, killed more white people than any other regime.
Now that is truly masterful. The Wannsee Conference.
Wannsee.
Proves the Holocaust skeptics wrong. So you accept the legitimacy of the documentation from the Wannsee Conference. You accept the legitimacy, therefore, of the figures it's showing to some degree. And we have, at the Wannsee Conference, some 4 million Jews documented under Axis control.
The cognitive dissonance here is amazing. Did you not get the point? Thorium was arguing from the basis that no Jews were apparently murdered before the Wannsee Conference, that the Holocaust didn't start before the Wannsee Conference, an idea which is ridiculous. To assume that the total number of victims of the Holocaust can be determined through the figures listed at the Wannsee Conference is to ignore the victims prior to the Wannsee Conference, which was my entire point. The concentration camp Dachau was opened merely a few months after the Nazis gained power. The majority of Nazi concentration camps had been running for years before the Wannsee Conference even took place. People had been murdered and enslaved in Dachau a full 9 years before the Wannsee Conference even took place. Or do you seriously believe that Dachau was opened in 1933 after the special request by Himmler to have it established, only to then just simply be there, unused, for 9 entire years, with absolutely nothing going on there?
And we have, later, by the numbers given by this person, some 4 million Jews saying we survived the Holocaust.
No, Thorium's claim is that there were 4 million reparation claims. Not survivors, reparation claims. Do you get that difference? These claims could have just as easily been made by people who got out of Germany prior to 1933 or out of Poland prior to 1939. By the way, someone who, for example, fled to Britain in 1933 from Germany and had the remaining 12 members of his family murdered would probably even be able to make 12 reparation claims for all those 12 victims. I think I actually pointed this out in the original video, so how nice of you to just ignore that. I also pointed out that when googling Forium's number, that 4 million some whatever number that he posted, I only find that specific Reddit thread. By the way, it's Wannsee, not Wenzi.
So, the big smoking gun for the Holocaust, the push forward to make the killing even faster, the documentation of the plan of extermination, which somehow forgot to document anything about any plan to kill anybody.
Addressed at SS-Gruppenführer Heydrich. Ich beauftrage Sie weiter, mir in Bälde einen Gesamtentwurf über die organisatorischen, sachlichen und materiellen Vorausmaßnahmen zur Durchführung der angestrebten Endlösung der Judenfrage vorzulegen. Signed Hermann Göring.
This resulted in 0 Jews died, because they all died before the Wannsee Conference, since the numbers at the Wannsee Conference and the numbers after the Second World War were pretty much the same.
Anyway, I have made my point very clear in the video, but I will reiterate. Prior to 1942, Jewish ghettos are established as well as concentration camps. During the war, SS Einsatzgruppen murdered Jews behind front lines in massacres, especially in Greece, Serbia, and Poland. During Operation Barbarossa, the Einsatzgruppen of the SS also operated behind the Soviet front in modern-day Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. The Wannsee Conference, as can be seen in the document I showed you earlier, concerned itself with, to quote, Juden im deutschen Einflussgebiet, meaning Jews in occupied German territories or Jews in territories influenced by German authorities, which are mainly the Jews of Poland, Hungary, Greece, France, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and the Balkan territories, later on also including Jews from Russia and Nazi-occupied Italy that had so far survived the ghettos and concentration camps and are to be, consequently, after the Wannsee Conference, to be transported to extermination camps or to be exterminated in the camps at which they were already interned.
Now, if we want to get into the question of whether the numbers add up, well, here's a map from the Jewish Virtual Library showing the locations of Jews in 1930s Europe. And here is a map of the greatest extent of Axis control in Europe. Now, does it seem plausible that with those numbers and those boundaries, that 6 million Jews were killed? Or, per the compensation claims through West Germany, that 10 million Jews were even in that area at any time prior to 1945? Does that seem at all plausible?
Yes, how can this massive, big continent at any point in history ever have 10 million people on it? That's impossible. Doesn't make any sense, does it? You fucking moron.
Now that's interesting. Dachau was a labor camp. It was not an extermination camp. Funny thing, the story used to be that Dachau was an extermination camp. The same thing was also said about Bergen-Belsen. But with further investigation over the years, it was found that the stories of gas chambers in Belsen and in Dachau and in every single camp taken over by Western powers rather than the Soviet Union were completely false. That there were no gas chambers in Dachau, unlike the original stories. No gas chambers in Belsen, although we still have that wonderful Sex Pistols song.
This is the Dachau gas chamber, completed in 1944. It killed 6 out of the 9 people it was supposed to kill and was not used afterwards anymore, liberated by American troops. This is the Mauthausen gas chamber, which was fully operational and used to kill several thousand people, liberated by American troops. This is the Strutthof gas chamber in eastern France, used to test chemical weapons on prisoners, liberated by by American and French troops. And this is Castle Hartheim, an institution for mentally disabled people, which had its basement showers used to gas mentally disabled people, as well as sick prisoners from nearby concentration camps. Admittedly, the number of gas chambers in Western Europe is lower than in Eastern Europe, yet their very existence proves that the gas chambers for mass extermination of peoples is not a Soviet propaganda invention. And more importantly for us here is Castle Hartheim. There's something that many outside of Germany don't know about the Nazi program to exterminate mentally disabled people for being, quote, unfit for life. The Nazis had to stop it because the relatives and many others wanted it to end and protested against it. Why is that relevant? Well, because the idea that the average Fritz and Heidi didn't know what was going on is absurd. We even have written complaints, for example, to the commander of the concentration camp Mauthausen, complaining about the noise. And something else that some people don't know is that if you were a farmer or a business owner and happened to be a member of the Nazi party, you could even rent a Polish slave from the SS. I find it also interesting, and it is very important to point out, how you tie death in a concentration camp to the gas chambers, as if there was supposedly no other way to die in such a miserable place, through either starvation, disease, or simply through the brutal mistreatment by the sadistic guards.
By the most amazing of coincidences, every single camp which was not found to not actually be an extermination camp was in Soviet territory after the winners had divided up their spoils. Every single camp that is today officially recognized as an extermination camp was locked behind the Iron Curtain, was controlled by a government so blatantly dishonest and totalitarian that they turned the words Pravda and Potinkman Village into slurs in the Western lands to denote lies, cover-ups, facades, and tight information control.
Potemkin village is a phrase coming out of 18th century Russia, not Soviet Russia. But more importantly, do you really see that as a possibility? Did the millions of Soviet prisoners of war also lie about their experiences? Did the Poles, the Greeks, the Hungarians, the Czechs, the French, the Norwegians? And what about the hundreds of British prisoners of war interned in the Auschwitz POW camp, who witnessed all of it and testified to it? Did they get brainwashed by the Soviets? Do you believe it is viable that the Soviet Union built up a massive concentration camp infrastructure that mirrored the Western European concentration camp infrastructure, then added a death camp infrastructure, then added a ghetto structure? And all of this, by the way, after the Soviet infrastructure itself had been completely and utterly flattened by the Nazis, and the Soviets were forced to use most of the resources that they had available for themselves to rebuild their own nation rather than waste it on some weird fucking conspiracy. And then happened to convince thousands of people, not just Jews, but from all backgrounds, be it Greek resistance fighters, British soldiers, Polish intellectuals, and Soviet prisoners, to all just play the book and help advance this supposed grand master plan to frame the poor fascists who didn't do nothing. What makes more sense here?
Indeed, it is ridiculous. For, after all, as has been established by the numbers you accept from Wannsee and reparation demands, the killing of Jews stopped after 1942.
We just went through that. Do you believe repeating yourself makes this more true somehow?
I don't know. You might want to figure out which historical documents you believe, which historians you trust. Just get your goddamn story straight, man.
Yes, when it comes to historical data and sources, I will, for the future, remember to use the same sources as someone frantically squirming around.
But let's not leave all the virtue signaling for the Jews, all right? Because it's really terrible to only focus on the Jewish deaths, because there were so many non-Jewish deaths. You make this very clear. You what, mate? Are you fucking kidding me? Only the deaths of Jews are paid attention to. Everybody knows the holy 6 million number. Nearly nobody knows how many of their own countrymen died in World War II. And this is the fault of the Nazis and the Muslims. The anti-Semites, if you will. Elevating Jews to the only important victim group is because of anti-Semites. Are you sure it's us who are just shitposting and joking, dude? This is what you get when you don't grow as a person, when you don't take an interest in piecing together the world and expanding your understanding of what goes on, and you just stick to the same knee-jerk emotive responses you had as a kid.
No, this is what happens when an American who believes that 10 million people on the European continent is somewhat of an absurdity talks about European history. The Poles, for example, as well as the Greeks, love to constantly remind us about World War II and what we did to them. And have you ever seen how Russians celebrate the end of the Second World War? Do you think they do that to preserve a conspiracy? Or do you think they do that because they won a war against a force that was literally out there to annihilate their culture and their very existence?